Hey everyone, it's Motzie. Today I'll be sharing the recap for Hinay Act 2. But since Act 2 is way longer than Act 1, we'll be splitting the recap into two parts. Hinay Act 2 Part 1 will be released today, and Hinay Act 2 Part 2 will be released in 2 days. We hope you enjoy the rest of these recaps, and thanks for listening. In Hunger, a Hinay short story, we learn the tale of George May, who is a former street urchin who charmed his way into power, first getting a better life through the church, then by seducing a nobleman named Friedrich Langford. Despite having affection for him, George went behind his back for power, becoming a member of the Ordo for Magic, and cheating on Friedrich with fellow member Jean-Paul Renard, the two allying with another member, Jovan Grigori. They were tricked by the unnamed member of Savard's inner circle into splitting their souls into objects of power called foci, Grigori cutting himself into many, Renard into fewer, and George into 3. George would eventually be killed when he, Renard, and Grigori attempt a coup against their leader and his inner circle, trapping all of them in split souls and consciousnesses in the foci, with only George keeping most of his mind. In episode 11, Nakaraan, or Before, a younger Mary records messages to her dead tatay, or father, about her eventual move to Canada. Another scene has Mary calling her nanay about the month before Sinapian, or episode 10, where she fears she's being followed by something, and she misses Donner's presence. It then cuts to Mary telling a story about her tatay's encounter with a death omen back in the mid-70s, during the Marcos dictatorship, where he saw his headless reflection in the jeepney during an evening ride. He later learns the death omen was for the driver, not for him. Disappeared, as many civilians were, during the regime, for violating curfew. In the last scene, Mary says goodbye to Donner, who wanted to make sure Mary was recovering from a hand mark on her wrist from where Langford grabbed her during their last encounter. She accidentally butt-dials Nanay and tells her of their discoveries about the Ordo, and ends the call listening to Donner's favorite old jazz song. In episode 12, Pagbigti, or Hanging, Donner visits Mary so she can bless his nan's crucifix once again, and so he can make sure she's okay after George May. The whole group, including Ashvin, later meet at a cafe to discuss possible foci they might find, mentioning a famous haunted house called the Christie Mansion, with an infamous hanging ghost that they plan to investigate. They're interrupted by a woman named CJ, who strangely asks to buy Laura's locket, which once held a piece of Mary Ann Weeks' soul. Donner's suspicious, but Mary didn't sense if anything was off about her, though she wasn't really trying to. Later in the week, Mary and Laura arrive at the Christie house, but Donner and Murphy aren't available. They were called to a crime scene suddenly, and the two women decide to try another day, only for Mary to be drawn in by the benefactor's whistling, which Laura herself can't hear. Mary and Laura find the inert focus within, but are separated by the terrifying urban legend of a hanging woman, empowered by another focus stuck to her ghostly body. Suddenly, CJ appears, saving Laura from the ghost with magic. When all three of them meet up, Mary is hostile against her, realizing she's also an elder. In episode 13, Bangkay, or Corpse, we hear an episode of DJ in the Dark, where they interview Abe, a ghost blogger who's followed a walking corpse holding something in its hand before it disappeared. In current day, Donner and Murphy are called to collect a corpse near Bridle Path, which, to their shock, springs to life and starts walking. When Mary doesn't answer their call, they restrain it temporarily and call Ashvin for assistance. They eventually discover it was holding a focus in its hand and decide to let it lead them to where it's trying to go. In episode 14, Tanong, or Question, Mary and CJ take down both the ghost and the focus, with CJ absorbing the focus's power. At Bridle Path, Donner, Murphy, and Ashvin have followed the corpse to the back shed of a mansion, surrounded by other zombies that have manifested there. Mary guides Ashvin through a spell to stop them, though it takes a lot out of him. The next day, the group meets back up at the cafe, where Ashvin can barely stay awake. They're once again greeted by CJ, who warns them they've gained the ire of not just the benefactor, but all their fellows. In episode 14.5, The Lover, we learn CJ, or Claudette Jean Villeneuve's, history. Coming from a family of lower nobility, CJ remembers not taking the order very seriously until the first death, where their leader Savard sacrificed a vagabond to power the first foci. She remembers it clearly, not for the death, but for the first time she locked eyes with Marianne Weeks. Marianne Weeks was the only black woman and woman of color in the elite circle, and the two began a courtship where they exchanged many gifts. When CJ said she wanted to marry her, Marianne suggested she marry her brother, John Isaac Weeks, who was happy to marry her so that the two women could live together. And then he died, suddenly. Marianne started working later hours in her study, still loving, but clearly diminishing, after her brother's death. CJ was unaware of why, until one day, Marianne died while they slept. Savard and the members of his inner circle came to her, and the one she could not remember, the benefactor, asked, "How could an immortal woman die?" Savard gave her time and space to grieve. Eventually, she would move to Europe, only learning of his disappearance through letters. Many years later, she would meet Laura, Mary, and the rest, recognizing Marianne's focus around Laura's neck. In episode 15, Sagot, or Answer, CJ tells the others of the Elders, her magical fellows, though she hasn't kept up with them and stayed away from their dealings. She discovers Marianne had been dividing herself into the good foci, and becomes their ally, even briefly flirting with Mary. Ashvin gets a call from Vanessa Bartolotti, who owns the shed they fought zombies in, asking for a meeting. They plan to confront her about her clear connection to magic and the Elders. Meanwhile, ghost blogger Abe sneaks into the back forest near Bridle Path's mansions and ends up in Bartolotti's shed, finding something that horrifies him. That night, Mary has a dream so strong it's caught on the tape recorder near her, where a frightened image of Abe begs her for help. In episode 16, Pasukan, or Entry, the group plans to infiltrate Bartolotti's estate on two fronts, with Donner and Ashvin meeting Vanessa in person, while Mary enters a shed that she suspects is a miasma of some kind, with Laura and Murphy acting as backup. Mary dreamwalks into an Escher-esque nightmare, with many doors that show her many people's deaths, including Alice James from episode 5. She eventually finds Abe and leads him out, but they're chased by a frightening, bloody, red-faced creature crawling on the walls, and the place they're in tries to trap them. Laura dreams, seeing the horrific red-faced thing at the window of the van they were in, before seeing the place Mary entered on the curved horizon. Over the horizon, she sees a giant golden hand, followed by a golden giant coming towards the van. She then feels Mary pull the rope they put on her to keep her anchored, and when she pulls it, she sees Mary knocking on the window, looking exhausted and carrying Abe. Meanwhile, Murphy, awake, realizes he hears no animal life around, and everything goes unnaturally dark. He sees a handprint on the window before he feels a tug on the rope in the physical world, and Mary opens the back door of the van, her sleeping body disappearing, arriving with an unconscious Abe. Mary and Murphy go to help Donner and Ashvin while Laura drives Abe to the hospital. Murphy's disturbed when Mary seems off as they walk up to the mansion. In episode 16.5, Mouse, the story of Nessie Smith, we learn of Vanessa Bartolotti's history. She was a comparatively insignificant woman in the Ordo, interested in learning from Mary Ann Weeks, but afraid of judgment from her fellows. She would have remained insignificant and forgotten, if not for one night, when she returns to the Ordo's meeting place to retrieve a forgotten book, and realizes Savard is still there. She sees him burning a miniature effigy of part of the city, and when he notices her, he says if she was anyone else, she would be dead, implying he doesn't see her as a threat. The next day, the corresponding city block is burned to the ground, killing hundreds. She goes to Savard's home and is turned away, discovers the household grieving from the sudden loss of Savard's son. Later, he would abdicate, and the Ordo would fracture. She snuck into Savard's study at the headquarters and stole many of his notes, studying them with an engineer's mind, before bringing them to Giuliano Bartolotti, one of Savard's most trusted. Bartolotti broke off a courtship to instead marry Nessie Smith, solidifying their partnership. The two were a force to be reckoned with, the only one able to cow them, the benefactor himself, gaining them as allies. In fear of his power, Nessie began to study Savard's notes on the other side of the veil, building a great machine to access it and siphon its power. The machine, when activated, tears Giuliano to pieces, leaving the horrific red-faced monster, and leaving a crack in the veil bleeding a miasma that's nigh impossible to control, though Nessie, or Vanessa, Bartolotti, is able to build the Escher's nightmare structure that keeps it from spreading. She believes nobody's able to survive it until Mary does, and is interested in gaining her as an ally to take the benefactor down, whom she's convinced is William Savard himself. In episode 17, Kasunduan, or Pact, an old homeless man walks into Ashvin's store, with only Evelyn present as his intern, knocking into something accidentally and leaving something behind. Meanwhile, Donner and Ashvin meet Vanessa, who reveals to them details about the elders and their leader, the benefactor, as well as her inability to use the power from the rift she formed in her shed. She tells them they should go after his right-hand man, Richard Henry, and gives them a meeting place and time to do so. Donner and Ashvin are reluctant to make a deal, but Vanessa tells them Mary's in danger and tricks them into thinking she's got control over her safety. They're pushed into a deal, only for Murphy and Mary to come in, Mary forcing Vanessa to loop her into the deal as well, dividing the possible consequences of breaking it. As they walk away, Murphy discusses his distrust of Mary's power with Donner, who is unwilling to distrust her, though he implies the reason he's loyal to her is her ability to give them answers he's been seeking for decades, which Murphy calls out. In episode 18, Katay, or Slaughter, DJ in the Dark returns with 2 new stories from Kay and Gerard. Kay talks of their experience, first mentioning the legend of Dogman, a man with a dog's head. They then share about a toxic relationship they had as a teenager, dating a young 20-something who started stalking them when they broke up, though they got protection and encouragement from their friends. To de-stress, Kay and their 6 friends, and a pit bull mix named Pig, went camping up north for 3 nights, enjoying themselves at first, but then experiencing strange events, such as finding dried blood and piled sticks and stones, hearing someone around their tent at night, and seeing bright eyes across the river. Someone even stole their friend Christie's bag, which looked exactly like theirs. Eventually, Kay is separated from the others and finds Pig injured and tied to a tree, and is themselves caught in the trap that snags their leg and hangs them upside down. They see a horrifying monster with teeth covered in blood, a mask, removed to reveal their stalker ex, who wanted to scare them. While he's distracted with his own amusement, Kay hears a rumbling growl, and the next thing they know, the stalker is absent ahead. An enormous wolf, the size of an elephant, appears, dragging his body into the forest. It turns its attention to Pig, to Kay's horror, but it only licks Pig's injury and frees her, before leaving them both. Kay's friends eventually get them down, and they go home, their photo evidence corrupted. In Gerard's story, the old man had recently had an operation and was recovering in a shared ward when at night he saw a strange old-fashioned woman dressed in red, seeming to pick one of the patients nearby, before he dies suddenly, despite previously being fairly healthy. The next night, Gerard sees a man in old-fashioned dress, inexplicably opening a young man up from his ribcage. He's paralyzed as the same woman returns, and they greet each other, their conversation revealing to Gerard that the woman ate the man she'd picked the last night. They notice him watching, and Gerard is afraid they'll kill him, but they choose not to because he's not fresh. And he wakes up the next morning with a young man perfectly healthy, eating breakfast. The young man is later visited by 2 ladies, one of whom looks like she might know what happened to him. In episode 19, Lamon, or Gorging, Mary reveals to call to Nanay that she recognized the place beyond Vanessa's machine as Saraon, or over there, which she describes as a place across the river. Donner then comes to visit, to invite Mary to go camping with him and Murphy. Mary then gets a call from Abe, who thinks the hospital he's recovering in might be haunted. She and Laura come to visit, and on the way out, after Mary blesses Abe with magic, they knock into an elder that makes Mary react with visceral disgust and vomiting. They're unable to catch up with her, but her presence makes Mary investigate through astral projection, briefly dipping into Mary's memories of the last time she was in a hospital. It's when Mary talks to her aunt about Nanay not allowing her to visit home after she's moved to Canada, with her aunt encouraging her to do so anyway. Mary then tells a story of how, when she was young, she spent time in a hospital on the same night as the ozone disco fire in the Philippines, and she saw the souls of burning victims wandering around, lost, in the hospital halls, until her Nanay calmly tells them to go home and pass on. In present day, Mary eventually explores the hospital she's in, and finds the memory of the elder in red in the morgue, unhinging her jaw and swallowing human flesh, and packing choice cuts of the meat before leaving an illusion in its place. In episode 20, Siga, or Bonfire, the group goes camping as planned. Laura talks to Murphy about Mary being so obviously in love with Donner, and Murphy says he feels sorry for her, assured of her eventual disappointment. At the campsite, they hear an unusual number of wolf howls in the distance, but don't worry too much about it, as Mary tells a horror story over the campfire. Later that night, Donner finds Mary looking at the stars, the two sharing a moment before it's interrupted by a gigantic wolf emerging from the trees and attacking them. When the others emerge, the wolf seems to target Ashvin before Mary and Donner divert its attention. The two run away, leading the wolf away from the others, and fall off a cliff, with Mary's magic saving them in that moment. At the bottom of the cliff, Donner finds Mary seemingly uninjured, but she covers her eyes, unable to open them, and seemingly temporarily blinded, a side effect of using so much magic so quickly. Donner helps blindfold her so she doesn't have to keep her hand over her eyes, and guides her back to the campsite. Meanwhile, Ashvin, Laura, and Murphy try to figure out why the wolf only targeted Donner, Ashvin, and Mary, and suspect it was their shared pack with Vanessa. Because Mary keeps tripping over difficult terrain, Donner carries a reluctant Mary on his back, and they share another moment, until Donner calls Mary a friend, and Mary's silently hurt by the assessment. They all reunite, and Mary saves Donner from being attacked by the wolf, a Wahila and Mother Wolf, who begins speaking to Mary when she realizes her magic is raw and not rotten, describing it as gold and not rust. They find out from the Wahila that elders tried to capture her years ago, but she ate one of their heads, and she talks about a battle of dead things that she saw from the mountains long ago. Knowing they're not elders makes her friendly enough, and she warns them about the false ones, or elders, that they made a pact with before disappearing into the woods.
And that was part 1 of Act 2. We hope you enjoyed that recap, and stay tuned for part 2 of Act 2, coming out in 2 days. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/hinaypod, so we can make Hinay more sustainable. We've got a bonus episode coming out every month for the $10 tier and above, and anything below the $10 tier still gets early access to episodes, as well as other perks, extras, and behind the scenes. Please do consider supporting us there or on Ko-fi, that's ko-fi.com/hinaypod. And as always, thank you, we love you, and hanggang sa muli.
You're listening to Hinay by Motzie Dapul.